Good morning. I welcome all of you to my first class of the second general paper Ways with Words. I am Diviya Krishnan from Department of English. The long lockdown for COVID-19 pandemic pushed us to a new world of virtual lectures and worksheets. It is a necessity to just embrace this reality. Let us work within its limitations and explore the potentials. Hope you will get acquainted with this normal positively. In first semester, you have two general papers, translation and ways with words. Neena ma'am and I share the second general paper, Ways with Words. This paper comprises of 4 sessions. The first session is poetry, the collection of poems. There are 7 poems in this session. The second session is collection of short stories, which has 4 short stories. Third session is prose. In this session, we can see 2 articles. The last session has 1 act play. We will get familiarized with each and every portion in the coming days. So, let us begin with a poem, Once Upon a Time, written by Gabriel Okara. Have you heard about Gabriel Okara? Maybe you are not familiar with Gabriel Okara. Gabriel Imomotimi Okara, the son of Ijo chief, was born on April 21, 1921, Bumaunti in Yenagoa, Bayelsa State, Nigeria. He was educated at Yaba Higher College. He is a Nigerian poet and novelist whose verse had been translated into several languages by the early 1960s. Gabriel Okara's full name is Gabriel Imomotimi Okara. The son of Ijo chief, was born on April 21, 1921 in Nigeria. About his education, he was educated at Yaba Higher College. Okara is a Nigerian poet and novelist whose verse had been translated into several languages by the early 1960s. Okara wrote poems, novels, etc. So we can call him as Nigerian poet and novelist. We can see that his poems have been translated into several languages. Okara, the first modernist poet of Anglophone Africa. He has been called the Nigerian Negritudist. What does Nigerian Negritudist mean? Negritudist means a person who is consciousness of and pride in the cultural and physical aspects of African heritage. Okara, he is conscious and also pride in the cultural and physical aspects of African heritage. He was very concerned with what happens when the ancient culture of Africa is influenced with modern Western culture. He always talked about African culture throughout his works. During World War II, he attempted to enlist in the British Royal Air Force but did not complete pilot training. Instead, he worked for a time for the British Overseas Airway Corporation. After his education, during the time of World War II, Okara attempted to enlist in the British Royal Air Force, but he couldn't complete the pilot training. So he worked for a time for the British Overseas Airway Corporation. After that, in 1945, Okara found work as a painter and a bookbinder for colonial Nigeria's government-owned publishing company. He remained in that post for 9 years, during which he began to write. At first, he translated poetry from Ijaw into English and wrote scripts for government radio. He studied journalism at Northwestern University in 1949. And before the outbreak of the Nigerian Civil War, 1967 to 70, worked as information officer for the Eastern Nigerian Government Service. So we can see that. Then in 1945, Okara started to work as a painter and bookbinder for colonial Nigerian's government-owned publishing company. He worked there for 9 years. During that period, he started to write. At first, he started to translate poems from Ijaw language into English. Then he also started to write scripts for government radio. Then he studied journalism. He studied journalism in Northwestern University in 1949. After that, at the period of Nigerian Civil War, he worked as information officer for the Eastern Nigerian Government Service. Together with Chinua Achebe, Okara was roving ambassador for Biafra's cause during part of 1969. From 1972 to 1980, he was director of the River State Publishing House in Port Harcourt. After that, we can see that he also got the opportunity to work with Chinua Achebe. I think you are very familiar with Chinua Achebe. Chinua Achebe, he is very famous African writer. So he also got the opportunity to work with Chinua Achebe. Okara was roving ambassador for Biafra's cause during part of 1969. From 1970 to 1980, he was director of the River State Publishing House in Port Harcourt. When he started to write, I already told you, when he was working as a painter and bookbinder, he started to write. After leaving school, Okara wrote plays and features for radio, and in 1953, his poem The Call of the River Nun won an award at the Nigerian Festival of Arts. Even after his school, we can see that he started to write plays at first. At the time also, he started to write the radio scripts. In 1953, his poem The Call of the River Nun won the award at the Nigerian Festival of Arts. Some of his poems were published in the literary magazine Black Office by 1960. He has recognized as a accomplished literary craftsman. Then we can see that some of his poems were published in the literary magazine. You should remind the literary magazine Black of Fuse. Okara's poetry is based on a series of contrasts in which symbols are neatly balanced against each other. The need of reconcile the extremes of experience in the case of life and death are common themes. Preoccupies his verse, and a typical poem has a circular movement from everyday reality to a moment of joy and back to reality again. So when we speak about his theme, we can see that he gives importance to life and death. He always give importance to the reality, to a moment of joy and back to reality again. Okara incorporated African thought, religion, folklore and imagery into both his verse and prose. That is why he is known as Nigerian Negritudist. I already told you he is consciousness and pride of African culture. So, Okara incorporated African thought, religion, folklore and imagery into both his poems and also prose. His award-winning poetry published in the Fisherman's Invocation, it published in 1978, and his next work, The Dreamer, His Vision, it was published in 2005. One of his most famous poems is Piano and Drums. Another popular poem, You Laughed and Laughed and Laughed, is a frequent feature of anthologies. So these are his very famous poems. First, we already discussed about The Call of the River Nun. That poem won an award at the Nigerian Festival of Arts. Then The Fisherman's Invocation, The Dreamer, The Vision, Piano and Drums, You Laughed and Laughed and Laughed. These are his very famous works. Gabriel Okara can be considered as highly original and uninfluenced by other poets. He has been extremely successful in capturing the moods, sights and sounds of Africa. His poems show great sensitivity, perspective, judgment and a tremendous energy. Okara can be considered as highly original. Why we are calling him as very original? Because he was uninfluenced by other poets. He made his own style. He didn't imitate anyone. That's why we always that's why we are always considered him as highly original. He was not at all influenced by any other poets. He made his own style in his writing. Then we can see that he was extremely successful in capturing the moods, sights and sounds of Africa. That's again, I want to remind you, he was known as Nigerian Negritudist. He can easily touch the moods, sights and sounds of Africa because he was very consciousness and proud of African culture. About his poems show great sensitivity and perspective judgment. It has the ability to understand well and a tremendous energy. Okara is the best known for his early experiment novel, The Voice. It was published in 1964, is a remarkable linguistic experiment in which Okara translated directly from the Ijaw language, imposing Ijaw syntax into English in order to give literal expression to African ideas and imagery. The novel creates a symbolic landscape in which the forces of traditional African culture and Western materialism contend. Okara's skilled portrayal of the inner tensions of his hero distinguished him from many other Nigerian novelists. I already told you we can call him as Nigerian poet and novelist. After his school days, he also started to write plays and he also wrote scripts for radios. His very famous novel is The Voice. It was published in 1964. We can call this novel, The Voice, is a remarkable linguistic experiment because Okara translated directly from the Ijaw language. We already understood Okara started his writing by translating the poems from Ijaw language to English. The novel creates a symbolic landscape in which the forces of traditional African culture and Western materialism contend. That's why I told you Okara was known as Nigerian Negritudist. Okara's skilled portrayal of the inner tensions of his hero distinguished him from many other Nigerian novelists. At the same time, we can see that he has a special skill to portray the inner tensions of all his heroes very well throughout his novels. In addition to a novel and several books of poetry, Okara has published two collections of children's poetry. It's very important. Little Snake and Little Frog. It was published in 1992, and an adventure to Juju Island. It was published in 1992. So in addition of his poems, novels, plays, script for radios, he also published two collections of children's poetry. First one is Little Snake and Little Frog. Next one is An Adventure to Juju Island. So we can just go through Okara's works once again. 1964, The Voice. In 1964, he published his novel, The Voice. In 1978, he published he published the poem, The Fisherman's Invocation. In 1981, published the children's poem, Little Snake and Little Frog. In 1992, An Adventure to Jojo Island. I think all of you remembered well. This one is the collection of children's poetry. In 2005, The Dreamer, His Vision. The Dreamer, His Vision is a poem. In 2006, again he published another poem, As I See It. 2016, collected poems. Then we are going to speak about his awards. In 1953, Best All-Round Entry in Poetry at the Nigeria Festival of Arts. Actually, we discussed the work. I think all of you remembered well the work. Yes, The Call of the River Nun. In 1979, Commonwealth Poetry Prize for his work, The Fisherman's Invocation. In 2005, NLNG Prize for The Dreamer, His Vision. In 2009, Pan-African Writers Association Honorary Membership Award. So these are the major awards he got. One of the founders of modern Nigerian and African literature, Okara served as a link between colonial party and the vigorous modernist writing that began to appear in Nigeria around the time of national independence in 1960. So it is very important to know about African literature. So I want to give a brief introduction about African literature. African literature is a comprehensive expression of African culture, oral literary tradition, psyche, and contradictions in African society caused by the colonial rule. So its main aim is to express African culture through oral literary tradition, psyche, and contradictions in African society caused by the colonial rule. It reflects the aspirations, dreams, psyche, conflicts, and changes of African people living in the African continent consisting of West Africa, Gambia, Ghana, and Nigeria. Then South Africa and East Africa, about East Africa, Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda. So the colonization of Africa and the consequent British influences shaped African society, which was primitive and traditional. The colonial powers exploited the African people, tried to wipe out their cultural tradition, in short, shook the very foundation of African society. So we can see that because of colonization, African people, they were highly influenced by the Western culture. However, the introduction of European educational system benefited the African people. At the same time, we can see the benefit of the European educational system among the Africans. It opened new dimensions for development and provided prospects of contact with other countries. An era of enlightenment and intellectual and rational approach began. Through the European educational system, actually it helped them to make new dimensions for development. Then it provided prospects of contact with the other countries. That's why we can call this era as an enlightenment and intellectual and rational approach. English in Africa has assimilated African myths, symbols, folk, traditions, landscape, sounds, rhythms, and effects. Thus the naturalized or Americanized English is used for expressing African sensibility and ethos, which is called Negritude. Actually, in the beginning of this class, I already explained what it is Negritude. African literature is an expression of the cultural heritage, traditional values, social conflicts, and crises and powerful Western influences on the people of Africa. At least you should keep in your mind this last point. Anyone asks you what is African literature, you can confidently say that African literature is an expression of the cultural heritage, traditional values, social conflicts, and crises and powerful Western influences on the people of Africa. That's why the writers who started to write about the African culture, about their heritage, they are calling them as a Nigerian Negritudists. When we go through the African literature, definitely we will get the clear idea about the African heritage, African culture. At the same time, we will get the clear picture how the African people they were influenced by Western culture. So I hope all of you understood the details of the Nigerian poet, novelist, and the Nigerian Negritudist Gabriel Okara and African literature. Let us go through the brief summary of the poem Once Upon a Time. Okara is very concerned with what happens when the ancient culture of Africa is faced with modern Western culture, as in his poem Once Upon a Time. The poet uses this poem to convey his feelings about the loss of traditional African culture against Western influences. He explains what happens when a traditional African culture meets the forces of the Western way of life. The overall theme of this poem is about happier times gone past and hopes for a happy ending, for which the writer longs for as in a fairy tale, and therefore the use of Once Upon a Time as the title of this poem. Through this poem, he speaks about his anxiety, why the African people they were highly influenced by Western culture, why they are forgetting about their tradition and heritage. But at the same time, he is so optimistic. He believes that definitely Africans should recognize the value of their tradition and culture. So once again, I want to summarize all the points. Today's class, we went through the writer Gabriel Okara in detail. Gabriel Okara, he is a Nigerian poet and novelist. He also wrote poems, plays, novels, scripts for radios, and poetry for children. He was known as Nigerian Negritudist because he is consciousness and proud of African culture and heritage. He is also concerned with Why African people, they are highly influenced by the Western culture and why they are forgetting their own heritage and tradition. Gabriel Okara, he is highly original because he was not at all influenced by any other poets. He had his own style in writing. It's very powerful and clear to the common man. He always speaks about the African culture and influences of the Western culture among Africans. At the same time, it is very important you should have a thorough knowledge about his works. We already discussed about his works and awards in detail. So please go through it well. After his education, he also worked in different fields. We already identified when he was working as a painter and bookbinder, he started to translate the poems from Ijo language to English. At the same time, he also wrote scripts for radios. Then he started to write poems. So I think all of you got a clear picture about Gabriel Okara. The next class we will start his very simple and powerful poem Once Upon a Time. Thank you.